let's talk Adam and Eve for a moment. So in chapter 2, starting in verse 15, God took Adam, put him in the garden to work it and keep it. Then he tells Adam that you can eat from any tree of in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? He says if you eat of that, you will surely die. But right after that, in verse 18, then God says it is not good for man to be alone. He brings all the beasts of the field for Adam to name. And it says in there that out of all the living creatures, none of them were a fit help for Adam. So that's when God put Adam into a deep sleep, took his rib, formed woman, right? So we see that God told Adam directly not to eat from the tree. Now, and Eve got her information from Adam. Yes, later in the Bible, it says that Eve transgressed in this. And it's because it was still the will of God for them not to eat from it, and she chose to do it regardless. But Adam was the one that heard God's voice directly. And when he ate from the apple is when mankind fell. So now the question is how does that apply to us today? Well, there's some people who can't discern God's voice yet. He's speaking to them, but they don't understand that it's his voice quite yet. Then there's others who can discern his voice, who can hear him quite clearly. And those people are going to be Adam. The ones who can't discern God's voice are going to be Eve. The people who can hear God's voice very clearly or discern it very clearly are the ones who are supposed to be the mouthpiece for the people who cannot discern God's voice. And I could go into a couple of different directions with that understanding that we are the mouthpiece for the people who cannot discern God's voice. But today I am going to talk about how both of them had the knowledge, both of them disobeyed, but what the differences were. Romans 5:12 tells us that through one man sin came into the world, and through that sin death entered. Yes, Eve bore consequences in her actions because she knew what God had commanded and chose to do it anyways. But when Adam disobeyed, he took on a greater responsibility for it, even more so than Eve did. Eve may have taken the first bite of that apple, but when Adam was the one that took that bite is when their eyes were opened and sin entered the world. And things like that still happen today. The best way for me to explain this is going to be by example. So over the summer, I became friends with a lot of people on TikTok, and we shared a very similar interest in what we were doing right on TikTok. And towards the end of it, God had directly told several of us to stop it, that the time was done. Yes, we had played a very vital part in this, but the time was done. And some of our other friends kept going. But there was one in particular that I remember that I felt led to tell her what God had told me about us needing to stop. Now, there were 3 of us that had a confirmed God's voice in telling us to stop. This one person who had not heard God's voice on it, I did let her know what God had said, and she did not reject it verbally to me, but she kept getting drawn back into it. And it was similar with Eve. Like, she didn't necessarily outright reject what God had said, but she got deceived and drawn into the wrong thing. Well, the problem came is with the people who heard God's voice. I quit doing what we were supposed to stop doing. I've already very clearly in the past have learned my lesson that When God says to stop, it's time to stop. Or when God says it's go, time to go, it's time to go. I learned that lesson with him a long time ago. So I stopped, and I was okay with that because I was really done with the whole matter anyways. Like, I was just all over mentally done with it. But the other two people that had heard God's voice on it did not stop. In fact, they had let the girl who had not heard God's voice on the matter influence them into continuing to do that action. And does that not sound familiar? Like, Eve convinced and influenced Adam into taking a bite of that apple. But Eve did not do it in a manipulative, cunning way. Like, she did not have ill intentions behind giving Adam that apple. She legitimately thought she was doing something that was okay. Like, she had been deceived by the serpent. And it was the same way with this girl who hadn't heard God's voice. She was not doing it with any ill intention whatsoever. Like, her heart was not toward evil in it whatsoever. She really was trying to do something good for God. But the people who had heard God's voice very clearly had a burden of responsibility on themselves in that moment, and they chose to be influenced away from what God had told them to do. Recently, I did a video on rebellion and the spirit of witchcraft and the cycle of abuse that Satan puts us through. And in that video, I mentioned that in 1 Samuel, God speaks through Samuel, and he said that the sin of rebellion is the same as witchcraft. So when you rebel against God, you invite a witchcraft spirit into you. And that's exactly what happened to these two ladies. They chose to go against what God had told them to do. They continued on the path that they believed was right rather than the path of what God had told them to do. And they invited very wicked spirits into them, and they're on a rampage that is not godly whatsoever. But the one who didn't hear God's voice, even though she went further into the whole matter, she did eventually stop. And guess what? She doesn't have that spirit on her like the other two do. God has given her a lot of grace and mercy due to her lack of knowledge, due to her intentions of heart. She truly didn't recognize what she was doing was wrong. She thought she was doing a great thing for God. The other two knew that they were going against God. They had very clearly heard God's voice in the matter. So it was the same thing with Adam and Eve. Eve was the one that was deceived and lacked knowledge and still found mercy and grace in the eyes of the Lord. Adam was in straight rebellion. So if you know you can hear God's voice very clearly, be sure to follow it. Be sure not to rebel against it. Because what ends up happening is when you invite that witchcraft spirit into you, then it sets itself up as God in you, and you believe that you're hearing the voice of God when you no longer are. But also, if you hear God's voice that clearly, then He will put a responsibility on you at some point to tell someone else what He has said to help them. And you will not only have the burden of letting them know about it, but also of being that example of following it. Because even if they choose not to listen, yes, they're going to bear consequences, but it will not carry the same weight as if you were to disobey.